Catherine of Aragon arrived in England in 1501, she made quite the impression, with her marvellously dressed entourage of 60 attendants. Among them was a young woman who would become a servant of the Queen's bedchamber, and perhaps even kept Catherine of Aragon's secrets all the way to her grave. Catalina of Motril. She was born in Granada and probably enslaved when the territory was taken by the Spanish rulers in 1492. What we know about Catalina and her clothing is limited to quite a small number of sources. But today we're going to be exploring how we can interpret both Catalina and what she might have been wearing in Tudor England. My name's Lauren Johnson. I'm a historian and historical interpreter, and I researched and wrote a biography of Catalina of Motril.
My name is Sophia. I am an actor and I've played Catalina before. She's a really interesting character to play because there is so much mystery around her. For example, where she may have come from originally, and one of the options is she could have been Moroccan. So it's nice to play her as we share the same heritage.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? It's kind of tantalising. One of the only things that we know about Catalina is she is from Motril. That's it. And at that time, Motril is part of Granada, so it's a Muslim territory until 1492, when the Reconquista happens with Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, these Catholic monarchs taking over Granada, enslaving the people there, forcibly converting them. And it seems very likely that Catalina was one of those people who was forcibly converted and enslaved.
We don't have any images of what Catalina looked like, so what sources do we have for what Moorish people were wearing in Granada?
There are a few contemporary images that are really interesting. Like there's one by a German traveller called Christoph Weiditz, who created something called the Trachtenbuch, which looked at, essentially, it's almost like a catalogue of Spanish fashions from all the different territories in Spain, including Granada and Granadan women. So potentially exactly what Catalina herself may have been wearing during her time in Granada. And there's also a few other images of Moorish women and Moorish people in general across Europe, but they're almost always actually painted by European Christians.
So it's interesting that our sources are all from a European lens rather than from within the community. I guess one of those reasons could be because in Islam, it's not common to have depictions of people. It goes back to religious beliefs. So maybe that's why, a lot of our artwork is geometrical patterns and shapes rather than live people.
Yeah, and loads of those patterns actually you can see in the fabric from this era. Middle Eastern fabric is like highly sought after, incredibly luxurious and expensive. And lots of it has those beautiful sort of intricate pattern work. I'm thinking of like gauze, tissue, or damask from Damascus. And it's kind of the weird thing about particularly Spanish culture that even though it was Christianizing everything, it completely took some of those Islamic elements of clothing, of fashion, and incorporated them into its own culture.
So we know that Catalina was taken to England from Spain. So what sources do we have for that?
There's two documentary sources, pretty much from exactly the time that Catalina arrived, so around November 1501. One is a court document, which is called The Receipt of the Lady Catherine. And because it's all about court ritual, it is just absorbed in the detail of what people are wearing, what they look like. You know, there's 60 attendants who come with Catherine of Aragon, and she makes a real point of dressing herself and her attendants in the fashions of her native land. So this idea of being dressed after Spanish fashion includes potentially the fact that Catalina of Motril was there and was potentially dressed in Granadan fashion. The other source we have, which is even more difficult, is one by Thomas More, who goes on to become, a really big figure in Henry VIII's government. But at this time, he's just a London lawyer, effectively, writing a little Latin description of Catherine's arrival. There's a description he gives of members of Catherine of Aragon's entourage looking like escapees from hell. And when sort of reading between the lines of that, it could be, at the most base level, he's describing people who have darker skin, because lots of the imagery of Christian culture at this time has, for instance, demons, devils in images of hellscapes, like they often have black skin. So it is possible he's making a comment on the appearance of Catalina and other members of the entourage. But he also might be referring to the fact that she is wearing a long veil, because we know, again, from church images in particular, manuscripts at this time, that in images of the afterlife, you have people kind of rising up from their tombs wearing these long white linen winding sheets and shrouds. And actually they look really similar to the pictures in the Tracton book. They look really similar to the long veils that the Granadan women are wearing. These long linen veils might be what are called in Spain al-malafas, which I think derives from the Arabic al-milhafa. And effectively these were long linen, white linen veils that went right from the head all the way down to the feet. So these sources do give us a little bit of sense, problematic and limited as they are, of what Catalina may have been wearing when she was growing up in Granada.
You have to sort of unpick through quite uncomfortable bits of text just to find what we can. And we know from Spanish archives that she returns to Spain later in life, so maybe she went back to the Iberian style of fashion, or she followed the Muslim community fashion within Malaga.
Yeah, I think that's really likely. And again, when she comes into England, it's quite probable that she will have done what Catherine of Aragon does, which is take on the clothing of England, of this country. But unlike Catherine of Aragon, Catalina of Motril was physically working with her body a lot of the time. So she's wearing what working women of Tudor times would have worn. Yeah. And we've actually got quite good ideas about what that could have looked like. So tell me what you are already wearing.
Sure, so these are the undergarments that would be very typical to a working woman in Tudor time. I have on a linen shift, I have on stockings with garters. Here I have a green petticoat, and then these shoes are very typical of Tudor fashion. So regardless of your class or your status, these would have been the shoes to wear.
Now, I notice that you are not wearing a farthingale, which we know that Catherine of Aragon and some of her other attendants did wear on their arrival in England, because again, the receipt of the Lady Catherine very helpfully tells us that they were wearing these bustious and marvellous clothes, with some of the ladies wearing gowns that had hoops bearing their skirts out from their body after the manner of their country, apparently. So clearly the farthingale, this sort of bell shape, was very fashionable in Spain at the time, not so fashionable in England, although it does seem like it came in about 30 or 40 years later. So clearly Catalina and Catherine were trendsetters.
Yeah, that's my thoughts exactly. Maybe she was also trying to assimilate to English style.
So if these are your undergarments, what is the next step?
So next I will need a kirtle. So you'll see I haven't got a corset on because this part of the dress is stiffened, and it's front lacing because Catalina would have dressed herself, even though I'm not right now. So it would have been easier and more practical for her. And we also are using a spiral lacing at the front, again, for practicality.
It's got a lovely shape though, I have to say. Even though there's no like separate corset under it, it still creates this real like beautiful Tudor line.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you look fantastic. Can you tell me any more about the specific nature of the entire ensemble?
Sure. Well, it's woolen, which is good for the cold weather of England. I've also got this finish on the sleeves as well for warm and wet weather. It's also got small sleeves. They're not big drapey sleeves like French gowns because Catalina has to go to work. She needs to do things with her hands and be practical. So it is a practical dress. And with this being a kirtle, higher status women would have put a gown on top, but Catalina needs to go to work. She wants to keep it practical. The sleeves are already practical enough, so there wouldn't be a gown on top of this.
But am I right in thinking that this is not the complete look? We do actually have another layer to add on?
Correct, yes. We are going to be adding a partlet to here.
So here is your beautiful partlet.
Yes, so this would have been worn for modesty. It's warm, covers this area.
And you can choose for yourself if you want your collar up or down.
Collar up always.
And the fact that this just ties on like this or could be pinned means you can put it on over even a great big French gown with giant sleeves.
So we have chosen this pattern as a nod to Catalina's heritage. There are no sources to say this is what it would have looked like, but it's similar in pattern to some of remaining prints from North Africa and Spain. Also, the pomegranate shape was Catherine of Aragon's symbol. So we've been able to make choices and sort of interpret what she might have worn for her. Probably more choices than she would have had. How much do we know about what sort of autonomy or how much say Catalina would have had in what she wore?
Well, it's an interesting question because, of course, she's a servant, and servants within the Tudor court, even really like high-placed ones, were pretty much all wearing something called livery. So it's not quite a uniform, but it's definitely a dress code with different hierarchical layers to it. But with Catalina of Motril, there is this added layer that she has been enslaved. And it seems likely that when she came into England, she was, to all intents and purposes, a free woman. We know from other examples of people who had been enslaved, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, who come to England are able, from that point onwards, even if they return to their native country, they are able to maintain their state of freedom. So it seems very likely, given that Catalina is referred to as having once been the queen's slave or enslaved, that that was the case for her. But of course, being still a servant, she is financially tied to Catherine of Aragon. So there's economic and sort of power dynamics there that are definitely going to limit her ability to express herself and to do what she wants.
She leaves and goes back to Spain, so maybe that longing to leave was always there.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because we know that Catalina has this very unusually intimate knowledge of Catherine of Aragon. She's termed as having been involved in the secret services of her bedchamber, which, the mind boggles what exactly that means. But clearly she's very physically close to her. So there's going to be a sort of intimacy, a personal relationship, and yet the gulf between them socially is enormous.
So do you think Catherine of Aragon would have wanted to show off through her court servants in how they were dressed and who they were?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And not just show off, for instance, that her servants are very well dressed, and that shows, that she is a wealthy mistress, maybe she's a benign mistress. But I think also specifically with Catalina of Motril, there is the added dimension that this is a person who has been enslaved, who has been, in the terminology of the time, conquered by Catherine of Aragon's parents.
So we discussed the lack of agency Catalina might have had over her own clothes. Something we've chosen to interpret her in is this headwear.
And I am now going to pin a veil over the top. We've chosen here to show Catalina wearing a veil, but not the full-length al-Malafa that she might have worn when she was living in Granada, because for practical purposes, presumably that would have been a bit tricky to be changing beds in. But this does reference the fact that we have these sources from Thomas More and from the Trachtenbuch book that show women of Granadan heritage wearing things like this.
Yes, and women of all different faiths would have been wearing veils, in this period, so it wouldn't have necessarily marked her out as being Muslim. And we'd assume she was named Catalina possibly after Catherine, and that opens up a whole conversation about forced conversion, whether it's actually effective or not, whether Catalina stayed internally Muslim and she stayed true to that faith, or whether she was converted. I mean, we don't know, of course, yet exactly. I personally can't imagine that the forced conversion worked. If she was Muslim before, I imagine she would have stayed that way internally.
So are you now completely dressed as Catalina of Motril?
I just need some accessories. My earrings, an apron, a pouch, a belt, and a girdle. This pouch would be for any essentials. The dress doesn't have pockets, so she needs somewhere to put things to carry. We have here a pomander, so this would have been full of herbs, anything that smells quite nice and fragrant to let off a nice smell as she's walking around. And then here is a rosary. Now, even though I don't personally think that the forced conversion of Catalina would have worked, I don't think she really would have turned to Catholicism. It's important that she has that image and she maintains as part of now Tudor court that she is a Catholic. So this would have helped with that.
And when you're encountering members of the public moving around this Tudor court or the different palaces as Catalina of Motril, how are they tending to respond to you?
Most of the time, intrigued and curious. It's an image they haven't seen before. Catalina isn't in portraits that everyone recognises, so it's different. So people tend to have a lot of questions, which is nice. It's especially nice when there are other Muslim communities and Muslim visitors, because it's a faith they may not often see at the royal palaces, so it's nice to connect with that. It's also nice to play her, because there's so much we don't know about her. It's kind of like being a detective and trying to find out what we can and make our own choices. It's also just personally nice to play a character where we might have shared the same heritage. She could have been from Morocco.
And one thing we definitely do know is that Catalina chose to return to Granada when she was given the opportunity to do so.
We know she goes and marries a crossbow maker called Oviedo and has 2 daughters, and that later in life when he passes away, she goes back to Motril with her daughters.
And I think that's really quite touching in a way, because we know that it tends to be the women who pass on their heritage through these different lines. They're the ones who maintain this culture, the languages perhaps of Granada, some of the dress of Granada. And I like to think that probably that is what Catalina was doing as well. And then we get to like the big mystery of her life, because we know that by about 1530, the Spanish court are looking for her. They're trying to find evidence about the marriage of Catherine of Aragon to Henry VIII, and before that to Prince Arthur. But of course, we don't exactly know what Catalina knew, because although she's referred to in the sources as being very well informed about these two unions, and presumably therefore about whether both were consummated, what happened in the marriage beds, we don't know if she ever gave evidence. We don't know what she did.
And it's easy to assume if she hadn't given evidence, that's because of a friendship with Catherine, or, you know, maybe fearing for her own safety. But also, if she was Muslim, then it would have been considered haram to gossip about something that wasn't to do with her. So I think that could also come into play.
That's really interesting, that there might have been that active choice from her own belief and heritage that she made not to be found. Catalina of Motril would have worn lots of different styles of dress throughout her life, from living under Moorish rule, then Spanish, then English, and then back to Spanish. And we might never actually know what she really looked like, but I think it's so fascinating to look at the sources that we have and to analyse them and what they tell us about cultural diversity in this time. And through that, we can kind of get an interpretation of Catalina that brings her back to life.